So just hopefully everybody's here by now. Sorry for the slightly late start. I'd just like to welcome everyone to the Threatened Glider Recovery webinar. So if you're waiting to join, please do jump on, just give you a minute. Okay. So my name's Karen Cox and I'm the Communications Officer for Wildlife Queensland. I'm filling in today for Matt Cecil, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us. So we send our care and well wishes for Matt and his family at this time. I'd also like to begin in the spirit of reconciliation by just acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and work, paying our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will take about an hour and a quarter and we will have some time for Q&A afterwards. We're supported by the Australian Government's Bushfire Recovery for Wildlife and their Habitats program. And that meant that some funding was made available after those catastrophic bushfires of 2019 to 2020 to try to recover some of the ecosystems and the species that were affected by those fires. So for South East Queensland, that meant two of our largest gliding mammal species, the endangered greater glider, which you just saw there on screen, and the very noisy but also endangered yellow-bellied glider. So a kind of umbrella working group was put together, particularly to look at glider recovery in those sections that were burnt, and they included parts of the Scenic Rim, Somerset, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast local government areas. So that was kind of the geographic scope of some of the project work that was going on for these two species. So a collaborative working group was put together so that we could share and pool resources and share data. So led by Landcare, a group was formed that was Noosa District Landcare, Wildlife Queensland's Queensland Glider Network and Yellow-bellied Glider Project and Healthy Land and Water. So collaboratively, these organisations have come together to sort of increase landholder knowledge about the conservation needs of these gliders and undertake surveys to look for greater gliders within those project areas using various different detection methods and to ground truth some of the existing and historical mapping that's been done for these species and just update that on WildNet so we have a better idea of where greater gliders and yellow-bellied gliders are living and persisting, particularly following these fires. So a key part of the project initially was educating landholders because these two species occur quite a lot on private property. So Wildlife Queensland, our Queensland Glider Network and Yellow-bellied Glider Project, together sometimes with Healthy Land and Water, ran 4 educational landholder workshops, and they were at Gatton, Jimna, Crow's Nest and Lake Muggera, and they were really to sort of underscore the need for landholders to get involved in glider conservation and the simple things that they can do to help these species out, which include preserving tree hollows and remnant vegetation, installing nest boxes and revegetating habitats where they can. So Paul Reevy, our lovely project officer from Queensland Glider Network, who you'll hear a bit more from later on, also put together a comprehensive revegetation guide for landholders about these two species. So that's available for everyone to download, and please do share it with anyone you know who might be interested in conserving gliders on their property. We also did a little best practice guideline for spotlighting for gliders and for installing nest boxes on your property. So that was sort of a bit of a key education initiative that was based around this project. So you will have the chance to download that and we will make links available after the webinar as well. So today's webinar is basically about sharing some of those simple actions that you can take and landholders can take to help these gliders out, but also sharing the outcomes of some of the research and conservation efforts that have been done as part of this broader project. So first up, we will have Paul Reevy from Queensland Glider Network, and he's going to introduce some of those key threatening processes for these gliders and how you can help. And that will be followed by Liz Gould from Healthy Land and Water, who'll explain exactly what we learned about the drivers of site occupancy for large gliders over this project. And then Rachel Lyons from Noosa District Landcare Group will follow up, and she'll elaborate on some of the trials and tribulations that we had searching for gliders, particularly in relatively thick forests up near Noosa and Kalula National Park. And then finally, we'll take some Q&A after that. Now, please use the Q&A function that's in the chat if you want to ask one of our presenters a question. And behind the scenes here, the lovely Amanda will gather those questions up and we will deal with those at the end. If we don't get a chance to get to all of the questions, they will be made available after the webinar. And if you need to jump off at any point, this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to download the presentations and the recording later on. So don't feel too bad if something happens and you need to jump offline, okay? But we hope to keep you with us. And with that, I would like to introduce our first presenter, Paul Reevy from Queensland Glider Network. Paul, if you'd like to introduce yourself and share your screen, please.
Okay, well, yeah, g'day everyone. My name's Paul and I'm a project officer with Wildlife Queensland. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen here and hopefully. Is that working there, Karen? I'm going to take that as yes, because you're muted. But yeah, as I said, everyone, my name's Paul. I'm a project officer with Wildlife Queensland with a background in ecology and zoology. So I came on board last October and my main function here was to run our regional bushfire recovery project, which is targeted at the greater and yellow-bellied glider here in South East Queensland. So just before we go on and talk a bit more about our greater gliders, which are the focus of this webinar, I just wanted to go through some of the other species we've got down here because we're fortunate enough not just to have one or two species here in southern Queensland. We actually have 5 beautiful gliding marsupials, and I wanted to give you a bit of background on each because that puts the greater glider in perspective. So just running through the ones you can see on your screens here. On the bottom left, starting from the tiniest of them all, the little feathertail glider. These guys only average about 12 grams in weight. You can actually fit a whole family of them quite comfortably into the palm of your hand. Beautiful little critters. They're the smallest gliding mammal in the world. And while they're considered common in Eastern Australia, we actually know very little about them. They're tiny, they're hard to find. So it needs a bit more research just to find out how well our little feathertails are going. Up in the top 2 corners there, you've got 2 very similar looking medium-sized glider species, the squirrel glider and the sugar glider. In practice, they can be quite difficult to tell apart when you're out there in the bush shining a light 30 or 40 metres up into a tree. Squirrel gliders tend to have a thicker, bushier tail, and they're also a little bit larger than a sugar glider, but as I said, can be very, very difficult to tell apart in the dark. Now, sugar gliders are considered to be going quite well throughout Eastern Australia. In fact, some people refer to them as fluffy weeds because they seem to recolonise revegetated areas very regularly, as long as we provide something for them to live in the way of nest boxes, artificial hollows, that kind of thing. Squirrel gliders, while they're considered to be okay in Queensland at the moment, they are seriously threatened down in New South Wales and Victoria by land clearing. If we move on then to our larger gliders, we've got the yellow-bellied glider down in the bottom right. The yellow bellies are probably Australia's loudest marsupial. They make a really hideous bellowing, grunting noise at night, unmistakable for anything else. And they've also got a really interesting diet, which consists primarily of sap, and they obtain that by gouging a groove into the trunk of a tree with their really sharp, strong lower incisors. And individual sap trees used by yellow-bellied glider families can be used for generations and decades at a time. And it's still uncertain why some trees are favoured over others, but it's probably got a lot to do with the volume of sap which emerges from those trees once those grooves have been gouged. So all 4 of these smaller greater, all 4 of these glider species that I've mentioned now live in family groups. They're sometimes up to 7 or 8 individuals that all live together and often cluster together in the same tree hollows. But the star of our show today in the center of your screens there, the greater glider, it's a solitary animal. So the largest gliding marsupial in the world. And as you can see from the photo there, it really is the teddy bear of Eastern Australia's eucalypt forests. Now, I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit about the evolution of gliding because it's a really interesting form of locomotion. And of course, it's not just restricted to Australia. We do have gliding mammals all over the world, including the flying squirrels and lemurs. We've got gliding lizards, flying fish that you've all heard of, and then my personal nightmare, the gliding snakes that you can see on the photo there of Southeast Asia. So I spend a lot of time in the bush, and I think if any of our Australian elapid snakes had evolved the ability to glide, I would pack it all in and be a desk worker somewhere, become an accountant or something like that. I couldn't handle the thought of a snake landing on my head in the middle of the night. Terrifying. So interestingly, all of the other mammal species that glide around the world live in rainforests, where here in Australia, our gliding marsupials generally live in the open forests and woodlands, the eucalypt-dominated forests of Eastern Australia. And the reason for that is that the resources in those forests are quite patchy. You know, it's only the odd tree flowering here or there most of the time. And gliding is just a really efficient way to get amongst those patchy resources and that kind of habitat. And of course, it's also a really convenient way of avoiding our native predators like quolls, pythons, and goannas. So back to our beautiful greater gliders. What was historically a single species that stretched from Victoria right up through to tropical North Queensland has recently been split into 2 or 3 separate species, depending on who you talk to on any given day. The taxonomy around that's still a bit murky and really, really confusing. I can't even keep up with it. So I find it easier just to refer to them all as greater gliders. And while they're mostly fur, they can actually weigh up to 1.7 kilograms, which is quite a hefty weight for something that flies around in amongst the treetops. And they can have a total length of over 1 metre, although that is mostly tail. As you can see, they're unmistakably cute with their huge fluffy ears and their long bushy tail. And they come in a variety of colours as well, which vary from the dark colour that you can see there with a light belly, right through to a pale, almost white. And then you get a heap of intermediate grey shades in between as well. So as I said, they do live in Australia's woodlands and wet and dry sclerophyll forests restricted to the east coast. And in that forest, they've got a diet that's actually pretty similar to the koala. They feed almost exclusively on eucalypt leaves. And like koalas across their entire range, they actually select quite a broad species suite to feed from. But in any given area, they'll have 2 or 3 preferred food trees. And even amongst that, they'll have individual favoured food trees that they'll return to time and time again. They can be quite picky. They also rely on a variety of different tree hollows within their home range, which can be anywhere between about 1.5 and 10 to 12 hectares. So quite a small home range, depending on food availability and the nutrient content of the leaves. So over closer to the coast, where you've got high productivity, high nutrient forests, generally a pretty small home range of a couple of hectares. You go out into some of those drier habitats around Chinchilla, Dalby, those sort of places, they might have a home range there of around 10 to 12 hectares just to be able to gather enough food to keep them happy. And they can use up to 20 hollows. Each individual glider might use up to 20 hollows within that home range. So that is a really, really high demand for tree hollows. And when they emerge in the evenings, they have a bit of a sleep in. They're a bit like me. They don't get up at the same time as the little possums and the other gliders. They're generally half an hour or an hour later than those guys getting out of bed. And they'll generally follow the same route night after night from their hollow to those preferred food trees that I mentioned. So they're really, really dependent on large old food trees. Their den trees are normally over 50 centimetres in diameter at the base and often over 80 centimetres. And the food trees they choose are generally some of the largest trees in the forest as well. And they also tend to feed really, really high in the canopy. So while they can be relatively easy to pick up with a spotlight because they've got really bright eye shine, getting a good photo or getting up close and personal with these guys can be really, really tricky at times, quite hard to get close to. And unfortunately, greater glider numbers have plummeted in recent decades and they're now in serious danger of becoming extinct. So back in 2016, they were listed as vulnerable under the federal EPBC Act, and they were then uplisted earlier this year from vulnerable to endangered, mostly as a result of the catastrophic bushfires that Karen mentioned that occurred in 2019 and 2020. And those fires burnt around 1/3 of all greater glider habitat throughout Eastern Australia. So massive reduction in numbers just from that one fire season. And sadly, development in urban areas is also a bit of a threat. You know, populations that had been clinging on in small urban parks and reserves are gradually starting to die out. So it's a lot harder to find them in our major cities and towns than it was 10 or 20 years ago. Now, threats I've mentioned already, but the greatest threat by far to greater gliders is land clearing. So after their vulnerable listing, clearing in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria actually increased within greater glider habitat. So that shows, the ineffectiveness of Australia's environmental laws and how it's really disadvantaging some of these animals. South East Queensland state forests as well, which are really good glider habitat in a lot of cases, are about to undergo a final suite of clearing before they transition to national parks in late 2024. And that's going to destroy around 30,000 hectares of greater glider habitat, which is a huge amount for these guys. Bushfires, as we've mentioned, are the other major threat, and the frequency and intensity of fires is set to increase under climate change. And while gliders often survive that initial fire tucked up in their hollows, they're pretty well insulated, pretty well protected. It can be in the months and even years afterwards as food shortages sort of hit, hollow trees start to fall down because of damage, that those glider populations decline and often become locally extinct. And that other photo there, while entanglement and barbed wire is not a huge issue for greater gliders across their entire range, it can be really, really important in small populations that are already facing other pressures and where every individual animal has become just so crucial to the survival of those small populations. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about hollows as well. As I said earlier, greater gliders have a really, really high demand for hollows, with individuals using multiple hollows and normally at least 3 or 4 within their home range and up to 20, as I said. There's a number of theories why this is the case, but it's mainly a case of avoiding parasites. Ticks and fleas and mites build up if you return to the same home morning after morning, and eventually they'll end up driving you absolutely batty. So by spreading yourself out amongst a number of different hollows, you just reduce that parasite load. And also avoiding predation as well. Things like powerful owls aren't silly. They'll cotton onto a pattern pretty quickly. And if you're returning to the same hollow morning after morning or popping out of the same hole night after night, powerful owl's going to be onto that pretty quick and he'll swoop down and grab you. And that's the end of that greater glider, unfortunately. There's also big advantages in being able to use different sizes, shapes and hollows on different aspects of trees at different times of the year and under different weather conditions. It's almost like having a summer and a winter house for these guys. And of course, it's not just greater gliders and the other gliders that need hollows. In South East Queensland here alone, where we're based, there's around 130 fauna species that are dependent on hollows for their survival, making tree hollows a really, really precious resource. So to put it really simply, without hollows, greater gliders and all of these other species can't survive. And hollows, unfortunately, are a rapidly diminishing resource in the landscape. Historically, every single hectare of bushland would have had dozens, if not hundreds of hollows of different shapes and sizes, suitable for all the animals that live within that part of the forest. But hollows are disappearing pretty quickly due to land clearing, bushfires, and even things like firewood collection. And because that clearing across Queensland and a lot of New South Wales and Victoria has just been so pervasive, many of those old standing hollow-bearing trees, those big old red gums and things you see in agricultural paddocks when you drive through farm landscapes, they're now reaching the end of their lives and there's no younger recruiting trees to replace them, which is what you'd normally see in a natural undisturbed ecosystem. So once those trees fall over, those hollows are going to disappear and the animals that live there aren't going to have any homes anymore. And while gliders, like a lot of other animals, they prefer hollows in living trees because they're better insulated. They will use hollows in dead trees if they have to by force of necessity. But unfortunately, dead hollow-bearing trees are even more susceptible to fire, wind and other things, storms, and they tend to have really, really short lifespans in the landscape of only a decade or a handful of decades. And while it's fairly simple to revegetate areas, and we're seeing an increased occurrence of revegetation across our landscapes, hollows are one of the slowest features to develop in plantings, and many eucalypts can take over 100 years to form hollows through natural processes. So what this all boils down to is we're actually approaching a bottleneck where we're going to see decades of hollow shortages, even with the increased amount of revegetation, and that's going to spell disaster for a number of our hollow-bearing species. So to counter some of these threats that I've mentioned, and Karen brushed on this earlier, but Wildlife Queensland has been working on belly glider, which was funded through the Australian government's Bushfire Recovery for Wildlife and their Habitats program. I find that name an absolute mouthful, and I'm surprised I got through it without butchering it. But there's around a dozen large glider-related projects funded as part of the program from Victoria up here to South East Queensland, and we get together every couple of months or so just to discuss what's happening in the glider world, which is always really exciting, and you get to hear lots of exciting news about everything that's happening. So our project has a few components. Karen mentioned the workshops that we ran around southern Queensland, and a few of you out there in the audience might have been lucky enough to attend some of those. And then we've also produced those revegetation guidelines that Karen showed earlier. So please jump on and download those. And of course, no glider project would be complete without getting out there, stumbling around in the bush with a flashlight in your hand at night. So we've been doing lots of that as well, looking all around South East Queensland, from sort of Jimna in the north out to Crow's Nest in the west, and down to places like Mount Barney and Main Range as well, just looking in fire affected areas or adjacent to them to see how the glider populations have fared. So in a positive sign on that note, in the last few weeks, we've managed to find surviving greater gliders in and around burnt areas at Main Range and Mount Barney, and also up at Crow's Nest. And we're going to head up to Jimna soon and have a look around there as well. That's historically been a bit of a hotspot for both glider species. On the flip side of the coin, we've also visited a lot of areas where there's no large gliders and very few smaller hollow gliders or other hollow-dependent species, areas that have been burnt really badly, and it's going to be decades or even longer before those areas recover enough to support large glider populations again, if ever. So what can you do to help our amazing greater gliders? Well, of course, we've mentioned it before, but you can download our revegetation guidelines for a start. It also makes me really good to the grant body, because they're going to ask me how many downloads I've had. So the more of you that jump on there and do that, the better I look at the end of the project. The other thing you can do is join revegetation projects or nest box monitoring projects. There's sure to be one close to your area. And even in the middle of our major cities, there's still a couple of pockets of greater gliders clinging on. So just because you're in the middle of Brisbane or the Gold or Sunshine Coast, doesn't mean there's not going to be greater gliders within 10 or 15 minutes of where you live. And of course, I've stressed the importance of hollows. So installing nest boxes is going to be a massive thing in coming years to address that hollow shortage. And because I've had this drilled into me by my partner, Jess, time and time again, until it's become like a mantra in my head, report all your glider sightings and all your other wildlife sightings as well by becoming a citizen scientist and reporting those either through us at the Queensland Glider Network, or you can also jump on iNaturalist, and that data will end up with us eventually. It's really shocking how little we know about the distributions of some of our threatened species in Australia. And even reports of common species like sugar gliders and species like that can tell us where there's hollows in the landscape. So even sort of common species can be really important. So just before I finish, I'd like to touch on artificial hollows or nest boxes, because it's a really exciting and fast-moving field. There's so many different designs out there. And while greater gliders haven't traditionally been all that conducive to jumping into your typical historical, front entry square rectangular nest box, there's now a bunch of specially designed and tested glider boxes that you can give a try. So boxes with an entry that faces to the back towards the rear of the tree, or little entries on the side that are close to the trunk of the tree, allow gliders just to jump straight into the hollow without moving around to the front of the box, which exposes them to predation and makes them feel a little bit nervous. They get a little bit shy in some of those nest boxes. Also molded plastic designs like the Habitat model you can see on your screen there. And these mimic the size and shape and thermal properties of a natural tree hollow. So I think that sort of thing is going to get bigger and bigger in the coming years. So if there's one thing you can take away from my presentation today, make it the importance of hollows, the way that they're disappearing, and the need to replace these critical habitat features in the landscape. So with that, I'm going to pass you back to Karen. Thank you all for attending today, and looking forward to listening to Liz and Rachel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Paul. It was very informative. I think we're all glad that there are no gliding snakes in this country. So I'd like to now hand over to Liz Gould from Healthy Land and Water. She's a senior principal scientist there and specialises in nature conservation, and she'll be leading you through what we know about the drivers of site occupancy for these two species. Liz, if you'd like to quickly introduce yourself and share your screen, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Karen. Can you see that screen okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Beautiful. So, yeah, hi, everyone. My name's Liz Gould. I work with Healthy Land and Water. I'm a senior principal scientist there, and my role is to, invigorate the community and stakeholders to get involved in biodiversity conservation, whether it's amazing animals like our greater gliders or a whole host of other wildlife species and even plants, those things that wildlife feed on. So my role is just to try and improve what we know about those species and improve conservation outcomes for them. So I wanted to talk to you today about our project, which was mentioned before, is one of a suite of projects being funded by the Australian government through their bushfire recovery program, which is called Understand the Drivers of Site Occupancy by greater gliders and yellow-bellied gliders in South East Queensland. I'll just click on my slide. There we go. So last year, I think it was only last year, greater and yellow-bellied gliders were both identified as national priorities for bushfire recovery by the Australian government. That was in around about April, May. They made that announcement, which led to a very quick run around trying to work out, okay, so we've got some funding. We know that gliders have been impacted. What are the best things we can do in South East Queensland to aid their recovery from bushfire? And basically, we met with a series of species experts, such as Teresa Eyre from the Queensland Department of Environment and Science. We met with Wildlife Queensland with Matt and Josh, and if you were on board then, Paul. We met with those folk and others in the department to work out what needed to happen in South East Queensland for these gliders. We had a quick look at the data that was available to us at the time, and that map shows you in the purple, that's the greater glider records, and in the pink, the yellow-bellied greater glider, yellow-bellied glider records from South East Queensland, and you can see the fire footprint in orange circle around there. So you can see that there are large areas here of Main Range National Park, areas up around Diongwa, areas up around Squirrel Creek and Jimna that were really significantly affected by fire, as well as areas down to Canunga and the Noosa area, and of course on Mulgumpen Island. So we basically, after that consultation, put together a $110,000 project bid to develop habitat mapping for both of the glider species, identifying that the habitats for the species hadn't been mapped particularly well, but also to try and work out the remnant and regrowth habitats, whether we could use technologies such as LiDAR and other remote sensing data sources to try and work out where those mature forests occur within those remnant vegetation, and then to ground truth it to the habitat through our targeted surveys, which is where Paul and the team from Jess have been helping us out. So where are we at so far? We firstly started off with that ever important thing, doing a literature review. Let's look at what people already know about both of these species. We formed an expert panel as well to make sure we were up to date with the latest information and knowledge on both species. And also part of that expert panel, we've got both Rachel and Paul in the room today, is making sure we found a way of keeping each other up to date with the learnings as we manage. So I know Paul touched on it before, but the collaborative learning and the adaptive changes that we've brought in these projects have really been facilitated by that frequent communication in South East Queensland, so that we really try and understand what each other's doing and how we can best add value to new information and inform the next stage of the project. After we developed some draft mapping, and I'll delve into that in a little bit more, we sought some expressions of interest from private landholders who might have habitats for either species on their property. And a big shout out here to the South East Queensland Land for Wildlife Network. They were really amazing at circulating information through their membership. We also obviously used Healthy Land and Water's quite extensive network of private landholders and community organisations. We worked out what kind of habitat assessment and survey methods we needed to check ground truth and mapping effectively. We did a first round of surveys. We've done an assessment of what the results of those surveys were, and then had another look at our mapping. We did that all-important management of projects, which is seeking an extension. Initially, these projects were signed off in October last year and were due for completion on 30th of June this year, so a really quick turnaround. But we've had lots of delays with wet weather and COVID getting in the way as well, and we were able to successfully seek an extension till the end of this year. We've used the revised mapping to work out the new areas we want to focus on for our second round of surveys, and we're about to get underway with that second round of surveys. So how did we get to our draft mapping? Well, I mentioned before that expert working group. It's really important to access the grey matter in the room. You know, not everything is published, not everything's available through a Google search. So really talking to people who know others in the industry, and we can bring all that information together was really essential. So that's that collaboration I mentioned before. By the time we got our project contracted, we were aware that Theresa Eyre and the Department of Environment and Science has already actually done some draft mapping of greater glider. I shouldn't say draft, they've done some mapping for greater glider across the whole of Queensland. So we were able to get a jump ahead with greater glider mapping and look at the work that Theresa and her team have done. But the new mapping that we drafted is all our own work, I guess, in terms of healthy land and water. And a shout out to my colleague Shannon Mooney, who's really been the driver behind making that work happen. We also had to find out what data we had on species. So we did what we call a data trawl. So we looked at what's in the Queensland Government's WildNet database, what's in the Atlas of Living Australia, what's in Queensland Department of Environment Science, more confidential data sets that we have to get special third-party agreement to access that information. And of course, the data that Queensland Glider Network and Wildlife Queensland gather. We looked at the literature and we consulted with that multi-regional working group that Paul mentioned before, which is people from, from Victoria up to here in South East Queensland, the knowledge that they've had on methodology for mapping habitats, understanding what techniques that we could use, but also trying to understand what were the key species that were used by both species in South East Queensland. So we know that they've got a preference for dry mixed eucalypt forest, and that's a preference. They do also occur in other forest types. I know Josh Boswell also mentioned to us that, yellow-bellied gliders will forage out into regrowth habitats, not just remnant. But the remnant's really critical, as Paul mentioned, in terms of having the greatest opportunity that we'll have those large hollow-bearing trees. So we identified some key habitat species and we checked into the regional ecosystem mapping to find out which regional ecosystems have those species. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of work happening in New South Wales and Victoria. It's focusing on greater glider, but they're trialling some habitat mapping. So we're keen to learn and understand what they were doing in that space. We also intersected then the remnant vegetation mapping with species records, and we came up with this kind of a map that's just popped up on your screen. In the turquoise is really the draft remnant vegetation mapping showing where we may have yellow-bellied or greater glider. They're both shown on this map. These pink areas are where they're intersected by species records shown in either the white for greater glider or the yellow for yellow-bellied glider. You can see the fire footprint. And based on the species records, the proximity to fire and the patches of habitat, in green, these circles are where we decided with the expert panel as to let's try and focus our survey efforts in those areas to find out more about gliders in that area. Some of those areas, like the one down here near Mount Barney, was actually identified as seems like it's a good patch of habitat adjacent to known areas where we've got gliders, but we don't have any glider records. Why is that? So let's investigate. The results of our first surveys. So Paul and Jess went out and hit the ground doing extensive habitat surveys and assessments, and as well as looking for the species. So it's important to note here that the habitat assessment was just as important a component as finding gliders themselves. We needed to understand, based on the mapping, why we don't have gliders in every patch of remnant vegetation. So what are the features of the landscape where we do find gliders versus where we don't find gliders? So we selected sites from those focal areas. We again went through the Land for Wildlife Network and our own networks within Healthy Land and Water to find who's got potential habitat on their property. We contacted people, we negotiated access, and then Jess and Paul went out there and did the surveys. For the most part, we focused on properties which had large areas of potential habitat on them. The team went out and they've assessed 7 sites with our first round of surveys. It was very wet conditions. Unfortunately, only 1 greater glider was found in all the surveys and no yellow-bellied gliders. So some of the drawbacks or constraints on that was, one, the extremely wet weather. Also, we didn't have the acoustic detection equipment available to us. There was some delays with getting that in from overseas. COVID seems to have its fingers in every little pie around, whether it's surveys or everything we do these days. We did find that, I say we, I mean Paul and Jess, not me. He's not found me a greater glider in the surveys that I've been on with him yet, but, hopefully one day. We did find, though, that there were other hollow-dependent species at those sites. So some of those species include brush-tailed possums, squirrel gliders and sugar gliders and mallard nightjars. and other non-hollow dependent wildlife such as frogmouths and koalas and brown tree snakes and even ornate burrowing frogs were found during their nocturnal investigations of habitat. The general consensus from that was that there weren't enough large trees in the sites that we surveyed to support greater or yellow-bellied gliders. A little bit of detail on the habitat surveys. Each site was a 50 by 100 metre transect. We looked at, and again, that's the royal way, the layers of vegetation, the different structure, the different species at different layers, the heights, measured every single tree that was greater than 20 centimetres girth at, or diameter at breast height, it's called DBH. The height of the trees, their canopy width, the growth stage they're at, the hollows present in them, size of the hollows present in them, and evidence of fire damage. The results for those 7 sites are shown in that table. I don't know how easy that is for you all to see, but there's a lot of detail. That's just to convince you that we actually did go out there and collect a lot of good data. Whilst we were out collecting that data, Teresa and Erin and her team produced a guide to greater glider habitat in Queensland. So I've looked at the results that Paul and Jess came up with and compared that to the benchmarks established for the South East Queensland bioregion. And it looks like most of those surveys were actually based in the Burnett Mary rather than the southern part of the SEQ bioregion, which is South East Queensland. So there might be some discrepancies in the results, but it was interesting that they suggest that a large tree DBH of 46.2 centimetres, give or take, is needed to support the glider species. A density of large trees, these large trees of more than 32 per hectare, is desirable, but it was really important to understand that smaller diameter trees could play a really important role as feed trees, even if they're not hollow bearing. So when we looked at our results, we found that at only 3 sites did we have more than so lots of where we had hollows with more than 10 centimetres in size, and those are the ones needed by both of the larger species of glider. But we did find that we have got the right density of large trees in each of those sites that would suggest that they should be supporting gliders. So it leads to lots of questions as to why didn't we find gliders in those landscapes? It could just be the lack of hollows. Although the work that Teresa and co did found that there was a lot of variability and low reliability between observers' capacity to understand, to detect, hollows in trees. So that's why the diameter is such an important feature. But we took on board that feedback and we'll be using that to inform the next round, or use that to inform the next round of mapping. So based on the understanding that we probably weren't targeting quite the right areas, or even on some properties, surveying the right places on the one property which might have habitat. We then sort of aligned our mapping, or had a look at what other large hollow dependent fauna, I should say, have been found in those areas. So there's other species like powerful owls and glossy black cockatoo that also need the same sort of large size hollow, or powerful owls, huge size hollow, that our gliders need. So if we've got those animals in the landscape, accepting that they're really highly mobile, but they give us an indication that we've got those big trees. We also looked at some old mapping under the Regional Forest Agreement to find out the old growth values of forest types. And we had a look at the LiDAR that's available. That's that light from space kind of thing, and canopy height analysis. We already had some information for the lockyer, but we did a big chunk of processing for the scenic rim. And we've got some results shown there on the left. We were also really fortunate that whilst we're doing this, Griffith University and the Great Eastern Ranges, we're trialling a method of being able to assess forest maturity using a range of other characteristics such as height, which is what we were doing, but they also looked at cover and to biomass. You can see these 2 maps on the left there show very similar sorts of results for the same area. You can see it's our focal area. This is down towards Mount Barney. This patch here and this patch here showing very similar results in terms of that dark blue being suggested by Griffith Uni's work as being the more mature forest, and these darker colours in the patch on the sort of this top left image also suggesting those are where the immature forest occurs. So there's some good alignment. So what we plan to do now is that next round of surveys to focus in on those areas with more mature forests. Some of our key learnings. I touched on this before, but the wet weather and the short project timeframes have been challenging. We also know that it takes a lot of processing power to get some of that LiDAR information and turn it from data into something, a useful mapping product that we can use. We've done, through our collaboration, both with the others in other parts of Australia, but also particularly with Rachel and with Wildlife Queensland, we are getting better outcomes in the DES work as well, getting better outcomes in what we're doing, and I'll lead on to some of that in a minute. We have also learned that remnant vegetation, which is mapping done by the Queensland Herbarium on the best available data that they've got, but it doesn't equal habitat necessarily. We're talking about forests that are considered mature in terms of their proportion of height or proportion of tree species or structure in related to benchmarks, but it doesn't actually mean that these patches of vegetation actually have the habitat value for some of our more sensitive, more vulnerable species, such as larger gliders. We also know that the ground truthing is critical to improve our mapping understanding so that we can identify those parts of the landscape that we really need to protect. We can do revegetation, as Paul says, and that's, the best time to plant a tree was probably 200 years ago. The next best time is right now. But protecting what we've got is vital, because these animals won't persist while they wait for trees to grow. In fact, I think the results from the assessment the Australian government did was that the impacts of these bushfires is not just the current generation, but we'll have 3 generations of impact on these larger glider species. So it's really critical to protect the habitats we've got, where they're supporting gliders, and then the regrowth, because that's a lot closer, again, to remnant status than planting a tree. But anything you can do to protect trees or plant trees is really good work. So we mentioned that, and identifying those mature forests gives us the opportunity to identify in a mapping sense, where should we protect? Where do we need to prioritise restoration to allow regrowth to mature? Where do we need to improve connectivity between tracts of vegetation? And where do we need to do that targeted revegetation to help the landscape to recover? And we're hoping that that remote methodology being trialled might give us some good answers in that space. So next steps, the glider detection dog. Now, Rachel's going to talk about the glider detection dog. We're hoping maybe in our second round of surveys we'll use the amazing skills of conservation detection dogs to improve our knowledge and understanding of where gliders may occur and to be able to survey greater areas. Dogs can't assess habitat in the way Paul and Jess can, but they might be able to find us some gliders, more gliders. Paul. We need to, once we've done that second round of surveys, we'll refine our mapping and we'll compare the results. I'll have a look at those with the expert panel and refine that mapping. We do have a presentation coming up in November with the results of some of our work, or to showcase where we've got to by that point with the Ecological Society of Australia and the Society of Conservation Biology Oceania. And that's a glider symposium. So that's a really good outcome that's come from this funding, is having groups from Victoria through to South East Queensland working on gliders. There's a whole symposium now happening on glider recovery at this coming conference, and a fantastic opportunity to share learnings and build on our knowledge for future glider conservation. And of course, key for everything that Healthy Land and Water does is trying to make these decision support tools that will come out of the habitat mapping available to people to use to guide conservation and protection of habitat and to facilitate population recovery. And that's me done. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that, Liz. I think you'll all agree that just the sheer volume of work that's being done in the background by these collaborative groups is just incredible. So with that, I would like to hand over to our last presenter today, Rachel Lyons from Noosa District Landcare Group. Rachel's the business and partnerships manager there, but she's also extremely lucky because she has a population of wild greater gliders on her property that she's been monitoring for over 20 years. So Rachel will also have a lot to say about on-ground actions that we've been doing with glider surveys up at Noosa and Kalula National Park. So take it away, Rachel.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks Liz and Paul for your talks previously. I'd like to talk about a project that we have been running over the last probably 6 to 8 months up in the Noosa and Kalula areas in relation to both yellow-bellied and greater gliders. As we've spoken about so far, several areas of known habitat for greater gliders and yellow-bellies were affected during the 2019 fires. However, our understanding of the population in our region anyway is extremely poor, so we weren't really able to gauge the full significance of the impact of the fires on our regional population. So the project that we were able to receive funding for through the bushfire recovery program had two main aims. One was to increase knowledge of greater gliders in our local community, and we did that through a workshop, fact sheets, and some community survey, or people coming out and doing surveys with us. The other obvious outcome we wanted to know about is finding out more places where we had gliders in our landscape. Previously, we had very little records of particularly greater gliders in the Noosa region, even though we kind of knew there was most likely more. There's three phases to the project. The first phase was to test the use of a trained greater glider scout detection dog against visual night spotting survey techniques, just so that we are sure that we've got the right survey detection methodologies in operation. The second phase of the project was to install 50 greater glider nest boxes in critical locations. And the final phase was to undertake audio surveys of the yellow-bellied gliders in the Kalula fire area up to the north a little. So there's a couple of motivations for wanting to look at alternate survey or detection methodologies. And I'm just going to mention a couple of them. One was a study that was done quite a long time ago now by Lyndon Meyer back in 2001. And it was looked at the effectiveness of spotlighting for detecting gliders of known radio-collared individuals. I think they had 20 collared individuals in a forest area. And they did different types of patch level surveys and pass and transect surveys to see those collared gliders that they knew were there. And this is a quote that was actually from the study. Basically, greater gliders is generally regarded as a species that is readily detected by spotlighting because it has bright eye shine and is relatively large and slow moving. However, a sobering outcome of the study was a very low success rate for spotlighting. And the statistics I've got down the bottom is patch level surveys, which is where you've got like a 100 by 100 meter patch and you're walking all the way through it, only had a 26% success rate. And your pass or transect surveys, where you're walking along a line, had an 8% success rate. So that means they're only seeing a tiny proportion of the actual greater gliders that they knew were there. The second motivation for up here anyway was a recent large lineal development project that only had one individual glider detected during the really good surveys that were undertaken in the impact area. And that was despite a lot of locals knowing that that area was both a habitat for greater gliders and yellow-bellied gliders. Consequently, because they only found one, it wasn't deemed a significant impact. It didn't go up to the EPBC referral process, and there was no measures put in place to deal with those species as part of the development. And so far, to our knowledge, there's been at least 11 greater gliders that have been removed from cleared habitat trees as part of that development. So they were missed. And the development obviously has, impacts, long-term impacts, including isolation of population. So we are clearly missing greater gliders in the spotlighting surveys that we're doing. So why is it so difficult to find them? Many of our greater glider forests are typically, or particularly up in the Noosa area, particularly tall, so 40 plus meters. They're multi-strata, often really dense, impenetrable ground layer that you can't, you get tangled up in lower vine or you can't actually walk through. So it's really difficult to see the canopy. Greater gliders make little or no noise or calls. Their scratch marks are fairly indistinguishable and they're usually in the middle to upper canopy level, so you can't see them at ground level. Thermal drone and scope detection work is largely ineffective, usually because they're up so high. They have a low heat signal, don't have a lot of body mass. And our temperatures up here are usually fairly high, so there's not a lot of contrast for thermal work. And their scats are very small for people to find anyway, and they degrade really quickly in the landscape. So we definitely needed to test an alternate survey approach. So our project, phase one, we selected our survey sites. We used the mapping work that had come out of the herbarium and the state work last year. We looked at about 25 sites. We made sure that we had a requirement of at least 2 visible hollow-bearing trees or stags within each 300-metre transect area. That helped us drop down to our top 16 sites for survey work. And we also did a habitat assessment subset, so looking at the species of tree we're looking at and also how many hollow-bearing trees and stags in the transect areas. Our survey methods, we opted to use the 300 by 50 metre transect lines by 30 persons minutes. And that's basically the similar technique that was used in the Burnett Mary report recently and also reflected in the standard survey guidelines for Queensland. Because we had community volunteers involved in our project, we also needed to make sure that our transect areas and survey sites were fairly safe and accessible, both from a workplace health and safety perspective and also for time and dollars, which we didn't, it was only a small project. The permeability difficulties through our forest types in Noosa also meant that we usually had to opt for either narrow tracks or walking trails or the likes as our actual transect lines through our forests. And we utilise, as I said, the survey guidelines in Queensland for our sheets and methods. So these were our survey locations across the Noosa region. So pink is areas that we knew were greater gliders were already, so either a formal wildnet record or anecdotal evidence. And the yellow sites are all of our survey sites that we looked at as part of our project. So tried to give a quite good spread across all the different forest types from the coast into the hinterland. Our spotlight surveys, we did 2 spotlight surveys for each site. Both were undertaken before we had the detection dog on site, just so there was no bias there. We did those 2 surveys on different nights. One was within an hour of sunset, one was after an hour of sunset. And as I said, there was a 300 metre, 50 metre and 30 per minute double pass along the transect. As we had community volunteers along as well, some of our sites we had up to 7 times the effort insofar as person minutes than your standard 30 minutes. But we did have a consistent principal surveyor, which was myself, and we recorded my observations separately as well. So in that spotlighting surveys out of the 16 sites, we saw 4 greater gliders were either spotted within the transect or near the transect, so either just outside the 50 metres. And of the principal surveyor, I only saw 1 out of the 16 sites. So it sort of shows that effort does, the amount of effort, the amount of people and minutes you're looking at usually spot a little bit more. So the main part of this project was about exploring detection dog work and comparing it to visual surveys. And in 2019, particularly the drought that preceded the fires, we had an influx of greater gliders coming into the care system. It gave us the opportunity to collect scat from 4 rehabbing individuals and also to store local tissue samples of deceased individuals for future use. Those scats, I passed them out to a few different dog trainers in 2020, and Nikki Wright and Ada, lovely Ada the Wonder Dog from Morocco's kennels, rose to the occasion and were able to train Ada in detection work for greater gliders, which was great. So greater glider scat, it's probably better called a scatter because it's small and copious in a defecation. And because they're up high, like 30, 40 metres, it sort of scatters over an area. So usually 5, 10 or 10 by 10 metres across it. It degrades very quickly in the environment, which was really difficult this year with all the wet weather we had. It's tapered at both ends. It's highly variable in size and shape. And you can see I've tried to take a photo there of some that have been in the freezer a little bit, so a little bit dry, but it's variable in shape and size. But however, it is still quite distinct from the other arboreal folival mammals that we had in our locality. So we were still able to tell it apart from brush-tailed possum or the likes, or ring-tailed possum. And that's Ada's foot with a 5 cent piece on and some greater glider scat. So really, it's quite tiny. So the detection dog surveys, we ran the same 300 metre transect as the night spotting surveys. We provided no information to Nikki or the dog as to the results of our survey from the night before. The dog went along and sniffed it out. We put little detection flags down, and then myself and a whole army of volunteers scampered around on our hands and knees with headlamps and magnifying glasses, trying to find these little elusive pieces of poo. We collected them up for assessment, and I'll talk about that in a sec, but send them off. So I'm just going to try and play this little video of Ada at work. And as I said, they do a scatter. So the dog, as opposed to going and finding just the one poo, the dog will start to get, pick up a scent, and then the tail will start wagging a lot quicker. And it'll kind of get a bit confused because there's quite a number of scat around. And it'll go and try and find. And you can see just here, she walks past and then she does a real abrupt turn back, and she starts honing in, and you can see the tail starts to wag a bit quicker, and she's spotting a whole heap of different ones. The tail's wagging furiously. Then she'll do a sit, and she tells you exactly where they are with her nose, and we put the flag down. and she gets a nice reward. She loves her balls. Okay, so then it was up to us people to go and find said scat, which was great if it was an open country where there wasn't a lot of leaf litter, but when you're in this kind of country here where you've got a foot of leaf litter, it proved very difficult. But you can see how accurate, that's the flag here, and you can see how accurate she was in finding that scat. So really, really better than we could ever do. So the scat was collected and collated according to the site and the distance along the transact. We collected information as to the tree species that the scat was found under so that we could look at food species and the likes later. In the process, we decided we would really like to get this scat analysed from a DNA perspective to verify that it is actually, categorically greater glider. So we connected up with Federation Uni down in Victoria, in particular, Dr. Fiona Hogan, to help us with that. And fortunately, there's a simultaneous greater glider scat DNA project happening down in East Gippsland with Cassandra Briggs, a PhD candidate. So we sent both tissue samples we had in storage as well as all the scat down to those ladies. And they're going to be doing some genomic sequencing, which will have great outcomes for both their studies and our studies. We'll receive those results later this year, and we're hoping that they'll provide some valuable information, not only to the verification of our scat, but also some information on the genetics of our local population. So some scat anomalies, aptly named food for thought. Ada the Wonder Dog is also trained in koala and coal detection, and she detected some scat on a couple of sites that was clearly not greater glider koala or koalas. And when we collected that scat, and I've got some photos of it there, and we sent it off to people querying what the crap is this, it came back as stick insect. So that raises a lot of interesting questions as insofar as do greater gliders hone in and target stick insects as part of their diet, or is it incidental, or how does that all work? So that was one sort of interesting finding. We did also find that Ada picked up on some worm castings at a couple of sites, and you can see, worm castings and pellet in wet weather all mushed in together, but pretty sure they were worm castings, and that we assumed that was worms ingesting greater glider scat in some capacity. So the good thing is that they're both quite distinguishable from greater glider scat and shouldn't get in the way of identifying greater glider scat separately. So the results of the comparison. So hopefully on this chart you'll see I've got night survey 1 and I've got principal survey, which is me, versus community survey, which is everybody in total. The green is where we saw a greater glider, and there's lots of red, which is where we didn't see greater gliders. But the last column is a detection dog with the scat detection work, and you can see all the greens that were picked up with scat on those sites. So as I said, they're all preliminary findings. We're going to wait until the DNA work comes back, but several of these sites have gone back to since then and looked at the trees that Ada got very excited under and was able to find the greater glider up in the tree that was obviously habitually using that area. So she definitely picked up on record or greater glider occupancy in some areas that we didn't. So statistically, about 1 in 16 sites was my surveying efforts. About 4 out of 16 was the group surveying efforts from spotlighting, but Ada was getting up to 10 to 13 out of the 16 sites, or 62 to 81% of detection work compared to us. So that will all be confirmed once we have DNA work. So that was the original survey site location of where we did our survey work compared to what we knew. And this is a map of now where we know that there are greater gliders in some capacity. The blue is where we're still waiting on DNA to verify. And there's a few black sites there where I'm pretty sure they're not there. Neither the dog or ourselves picked anything up. So it greatly enhances the knowledge of greater glider occupancy in our region in particular. And we got some whole new records up in the Wyndham Tableland, where there's wasn't a single record of a greater glider up there at all. Yeah, so great spread, but you can definitely see the occupation along the range is particularly important. Those tall forest systems through there. Okay, we also, as I said, looked at food tree species, and the results that we had do align quite well with the Guide to Greater Glider Habitat that was released about a month ago. And there was a heavy dominance of Crimbia intermedia or pink bloodwood on many of the sites, and we definitely found quite a lot of scat under on that particular species. So when we get the DNA work back, we'll be able to really hone up those results in particular about which tree species we were finding scat under. Phase 2 of our project was about nest boxes. So based on the survey results, we were able to identify some critical linkages that were at risk of isolating our population. And predominantly because they were separated by regrowth habitat, they didn't have any habitat structure in it. So we installed about 50 nest boxes of 3 different designs, part of a trial again, over 10 private properties to try and link up some of those isolated populations across the Noosa landscape. And phase 3 of our project, which is still wrapping up, is the audio surveys of yellow-bellied glider habitat in Cooloola National Park. Took a long time for the audio moths to land in Australia. I think we got them in April or something like that. But we deployed them out on 20 sites in Western Cooloola. We did want to go into Central Cooloola, where there was about 30 to 40-year-old records in there that we wanted to test after the fires to see if the gliders were still in that location, but the weather and the access into those areas just precluded that. So we did a lot of records, or did a lot of deployment of the survey, audio moth surveys in the Western Cooloola area only. And with those, auto recognition software analysis is still underway at the moment. So looking forward, obviously waiting on the DNA results, and post that, the genomic sequencing, and hopefully some genetic profile data from Federation Uni to provide some information about the population in this area. We have got some additional funding to do another 6 survey sites locally through a Queensland Government Communities grant. We'll be doing ongoing nest box monitoring and hopefully working with the relevant entities, councils and other land management entities to look at some strategic corridor planning and ongoing nest site augmentation in regrowth habitat. And hopefully as a result of this project anyway, there should be or could be a change to best practice survey methods for greater gliders. Essentially, both the motivations that I talked about previously and the results of our survey sort of show that spotlighting surveys really don't cut it in relation to detecting greater gliders very well at all. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much. And back to you, Karen.
Thanks so much for that, Rachel. We're just having a few little slight glitches with sound. So hopefully you're not hearing that at home. But as you can see, those detection dogs doing a wonderful job. Again, we've used them for some other projects here at Wildlife Queensland as well, for quolls, and it's really fantastic what they're able to achieve. So I'll just quickly share my screen with you now and we will get started on some Q&A. I think Paul has got a bit overexcited, as he's wont to do, and has answered a few of those questions already, but Liz and Rachel might also like to chime in for those questions. So just bear with me for a second and I will share my screen with you all. Okay, so the questions that we've had come in, Marjorie Spies wanted to ask why it was just the southern end of the South Burnett region that was being included in the study outside Somerset region. So, and she says that all 5 of these gliders are in the Blackbutt and Benarkan areas as well. So Paul has responded to her that, yes, unfortunately, there were some geographical restrictions placed on the project area for this because it was really wanting to focus on those bushfire areas. But if anybody else would like to unmute and chime in there, please do feel free. No? Shall I unmute you, Paul?
Liz, I can add something to that. So certainly with our first round of surveys, we did try and target those to focal areas that, you know, the expert panel had identified, Margie, but we are looking a little bit broader afield with the second round of surveys, given that we struck out a little bit on the first round. So we're happy to look more broadly. So if you know of properties that you think may have glider habitat, please get in touch. Just send me an email with your contact details, your lot and plan. I'll check them out with our habitat mapping, but if you've got your contact details and it looks like you might have the right habitat and hopefully one with more mature forests, then maybe we can send Paul your way. He's put in a request for just some nice, easy walking country, though. So see how we go.
Good luck with that. All right. So we also have a question from Lizzie Buckby, who's asked whether you find traditional nest boxes are effective for graded gliders, or are methods such as carved hollows superior for the species? So who would like to jump in for that one? Paul has mentioned that, yes, some of the nest boxes perhaps that we're building during the workshops and things are more suitable for other smaller glider species. But there is a lot of competition out there in the forests as well. So any nest boxes that you can put up will help reduce that competition. So Paul, would you like to jump in and just share that answer with everyone?
Yeah. So as I said, I think I answered Lizzie as well, that, yeah, they have been known to use those standard front entry boxes. They're not going to ignore them by any stretch of the imagination, but there's probably some slightly better designs out there, and a lot of that's actually come from work that's been done on squirrel gliders down in southern New South Wales and northern Victoria, where squirrel gliders are really endangered, and some work down there found that they were about 3 or 4 times more likely to jump into a nest box with a rear entry up against the tree, likely because it gave them a bit of protection from predation. And then that sort of transferred up in scale to greater gliders as well. And sort of the standard design now for greater gliders is that rear entry or side entry box. But I think I mentioned during my presentation, I mean, nest box design is such a fast moving field. There's all sorts of cool designs being developed every day. There's a lot of work going on at major research institutions around this and what's better for individual species and things like that. And yeah, I mean, chainsaw hollows are a great option as well. The one drawback to any nest boxes that I've been finding, just particularly in the last couple of weeks, I've had probably half a dozen to 8 or 10 people approach me and just say that we can't afford arborists to get these things up into trees. It's just crazily expensive to get a team of arborists out for a day. I've seen quotes at $3.5 grand for a day of installing nest boxes, which is just madness. So yeah, I guess that's the big limitation moving forward is just getting that funding, because a lot of our species do like nest boxes higher up in a tree. I mean, I'd be looking at 10, 14 metres for greater gliders plus, as high as you can get them. I've seen them 30, 35 metres up in trees. They're not one of those species that's going to use a 4 to 6 metre high nest box that you can get to on your family step ladder or anything like that. But I think Rachel and Liz have got a bit of experience in this field as well, so they might want to chime in with their experience too.
Yeah, look, that'd be great. We've also got another question from Elizabeth Buckby asking whether yellow-bellied gliders also prefer side or rear entries to nest boxes. So Rachel and Liz, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm not 100% sure about the yellow-bellied gliders, but I think we're still very much in an infancy process in regards to monitoring nest box uptake for both species. So we did a WIRES grant last year where we installed, I think, about 70 boxes, which we're doing monitoring of over time. And hopefully that monitoring and looking at uptake, potentially generational uptake. So not, they're not just going to go into it the night it's put in. It might be the next generation of gliders that are sort of pushed out into that area where we might see some uptake. So I think it's just about monitoring ongoing and seeing, what we find in that process.
Sure. Yeah. And obviously for yellow-bellied gliders, because they're quite gregarious, so they like nesting in family groups. Does that make a difference, Liz, do you think, with the size of hollow that's required for them? We're looking at installing nest boxes.
Oh, look here, I'll confess I'm not a nest box expert at all. I'll put that one right back to Rachel and Paul, but I'll just advocate for, nest boxes will support wildlife where there's wildlife available to support as well. So, I mean, if you don't have country for yellow-bellies or greater gliders, you won't get those species occurring in your nest boxes, although you may well support a lot of other native wildlife or other species that could well use those hollows. So I know at my place I don't have a habitat for those. I've also got regrowth forest with trees that just don't have hollows. So putting nest boxes up is useful for so many other species, but important to understand what your country will support and how you can conserve that and support those species. But in terms of specific questions on greater and yellow-bellied glider nest box requirements, Back to Rachel and Paul.
Lovely. All right, Paul, did you want to have anything else to say about yellow-bellied gliders and their nest box preferences?
Yeah, I guess just in terms of their demand for hollows, I guess it's a lot smaller sort of on a, per hectare basis, because a family of yellow bellies might use a home range of 30 to 80 hectares. So as long as there's a couple of suitable hollows within that 30 to 80 hectares, they're generally okay. They can survive in that sort of landscape. So I guess the hollow shortage isn't something that's affecting yellow bellies to the same extent that it would, say, a greater glider with a much smaller home range and a higher demand for hollows. But I haven't heard of a lot of projects targeting yellow bellies with nest boxes, and those designs I have seen that are out there, and it's only from a couple of companies. I think they've been that rear entry design as well.
Sure. Okay. So Ian Beale, our good friend, I think, from Gillies Ridge Nature Refuge has chimed in. He's asking whether he could mention their nest tube project. Ian, unfortunately, we can't set that up through the Zoom meeting today. But if you'd like to email me with that, we can certainly pop that in our Q&A and let people know all about the good work you're doing out there as well. I know you're doing some glossy black cockatoo project work, as well as a few other things. So if you can just send your question through, send it to communications@wildlife.org.au, and we can certainly pop that in the Q&A for you, Ian. And Kate Beskeen is also asking where she's best to email. So it would be Queensland Glider Network, and we will share a link in a minute to how you can report your sightings of gliders. So any species of glider that you see, if you can send us a sighting report through our JOT form at Queensland Glider Network, that would be fantastic. All of that data helps these guys continue to do their survey and mapping work. So I think that's about it for the questions. We did have Jacob Champney ask whether the surveys were spotlighting, and yes, as Rachel sort of mentioned throughout her presentation, there was some spotlighting, and then of course there was some detection dog surveys and stuff as well. So hopefully that one has been answered for you. Just being a bit mindful of the time, we probably are going to quickly wind it up there, and I'll just thank all of our presenters for coming along, for their wonderful research and for sharing that all with you today. And thanks to our listeners as well. And of course, thank you to the Australian government who supported this research. Please do jump on and download that revegetation guide if you have property and you think you might like to find out a little bit more about what you can do to help these species. We'd also like to thank all of the many individuals and organisations that contributed to all of this research. So whether they were traditional owners, venues for workshops, caterers, printers, conservation detective dog teams like Nikki and Ada, and all of the behind the scenes staff like our wonderful Amanda here today, who's organising all of those Q&A for us. We couldn't have done this without them, and particularly to Landcare, as this was sort of a Landcare led project. So thanks very much to all of those people who did get involved and help out with this task. So for those of you who are watching along at home, if you do see a glider or you know where there are some gliders, please do pop over to Queensland Gliders Network sighting form. Let us know about it. As I said, this data really drives the research that we're doing, and we just still don't know enough about these species. So anything that you can add is really valuable. And of course, any other measures that you can take. So please, report your sightings, download the Reveg Guide, follow the social media pages of these groups on Facebook and Instagram. So Queensland Glider Network, Noosa District Landcare Group, Healthy Land and Water, and the Yellow-bellied Glider Project. It really does make a difference if you like and share our posts. It just gives decision makers, it lets them understand that people really do care about these species, and they really want to prioritise their habitat needs, and they really want something done to make sure that we protect these species for future generations. So thank you for listening. I hope we see you all again soon. We will send you out a link to a short survey that will pop up after the webinar ends. So if you'd like to do that for us, that would be super helpful. And we'll also shoot you a link in coming days so that you can download these presentations and the recording of the webinar. And please do feel free to share all of that with anyone that you think might be interested. The more people we can get involved in glider conservation, the better. So thanks again, and we hope to see you again soon. And thanks again to our presenters. Bye now.